So we're starting Genesis. Genesis is the Greek name from the Hebrew name Bereshith.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 34.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And there's not a nice way to say what happened to Dinah, and there shouldn't be. Prince Shechem raped Dinah. Prince Shechem only loves himself, because real love, it always thinks of the other person. This is just plain old lust. And this Prince Shechem, he finds a difficult time denying himself from anything he wants or from any lust that he feels. And although it doesn't say it here, I doubt if this is the first time this ever happened with Prince Shechem, because I really wouldn't even doubt that this wasn't even a common practice in this pagan, male-dominated society. And I read one commentator that said that if you were an unaccompanied female in this society, that you would be fair game. And so King Hammer, he doesn't even rebuke his son for what he did, and he doesn't even try to correct him. All he does is he tries to appease him. And Prince Shechem here, he doesn't have any problem telling his father what he did, and he had no shame in this. And then he tells his father what he wants him to do. In fact, he wants his father to use his kingly influence to get Dinah to be given to him as a wife. And the Bible never tells us here what Dinah thinks or how she felt about her attacker, or about anything that she's gone through, or anything from her perspective. All we hear here is what Shechem thinks and how Shechem feels, because this is all about Shechem. But the passage does say that Shechem, that he spoke kindly to Dinah, and I guess that's better than being, beaten before you're molested. But we don't know how Dinah felt. She may honestly could have liked him, because, he was probably popular, because he is a prince, and it may be like one of our rock stars or a famous celebrity, because he is the prince of the land. And Dinah, she's young. She doesn't have much experience in life. But even if she did like him, I don't like him. And it says that Jacob, that he found out, and I think the only way that Jacob could have found this out was by Dinah herself, of her telling her father. So I believe that Dinah was a very brave young woman. And this is without any type of support like you'd have nowadays. There was no Me Too movement or any type of thing like that. And I believe that Dinah being raised in Jacob's family, Dinah was protected and that she was sheltered. And she probably had never heard of this happening to anyone before. But if you've noticed in this whole chapter, God hasn't spoken to Jacob, not even once. In fact, God's name isn't even mentioned in this chapter, because Jacob here, he's not hearing from God anymore, because Jacob, he's walked away from God's will. And it's not that he doesn't believe him anymore, but because he doesn't hear from him anymore, all he can do is use his own wisdom here. And just because Jacob is silent here, and we don't see him getting mad, and we don't see what he's going to do, that doesn't mean that Jacob is indifferent. There's just nothing that he can do, or at least yet, because everybody's away. They're all out tending the sheep, and they're away from the home. And when these type of things happen to a family, there's not always really a lot that can be done, because what's been done, well, it can never be undone, no matter how badly you wish it could be. And a lot of times, after this initial grieving, You end up thinking more like, okay, well, where do we go from here? And so Jacob, he could have very well asked Dinah, well, how do you feel? How do you feel? What would you want to do in this situation? And when King Hamor and Prince Shechem, and they come to ask Jacob for Dinah to be his bride, and which I believe is very bold, Jacob could have asked Dinah and says, well, do you have any feeling toward this man? Dinah, do you have any desire to marry Prince Shechem and to be a princess among these people? Because naturally, Dinah, she would want to marry somebody someday, but we don't know. We don't know how she felt. And when Jacob's sons were told what happened to Dinah, they were outraged, and they should have been outraged. But they didn't declare their outrage publicly. They kept it a secret, and they acted deceptively. They didn't declare war with these people. In fact, what they declared peace. And they convinced these men that there was a way to have a treaty with them and for Prince Shechem to be able to become a part of their family, and that they could all become one people. And so they were willing to make a contract with these people in Shechem, but that's only if all the men would become physically like they were, that they would all become circumcised. And Jacob's sons, they had absolutely no right to make any kind of deal with these people, because this is not of God. This is deception, because these Hivites, well, they served different gods. And these people, they were not part of God's plan for making a people for himself. They didn't have God's approval. But you can see there is a big lack of leadership of Jacob in the family matters, because he just stood by while his sons made these arrangements with King Hamor and Shechem. And it's because these brothers, Simeon and Levi, they didn't think that their father's response was strong enough, because they didn't think he did anything. Because apparently, the way it looks here is that Jacob did give Dinah to Shechem to be his wife, because we later find Dinah in Shechem's house. And Jacob here, he is totally unaware of his son's plans. So it was not only the city of Shechem that was deceived, but Jacob was also deceived. And the only way that King Hamor and Prince Shechem could sell that whole city of men to agree to the terms of being circumcised was to appeal to their greed. And by pointing out that Jacob, that he had a lot of herds, and if they were willing to be one people with them, all those herds, they would be theirs too. Because Jacob really had a lot of herds. Because even Esau's present, which was just a little portion of what he had, was 580 animals. And that was 7 years ago. So he probably had way much more now. Jacob was probably wealthier and had more possessions than any of the men of Shechem. And Simeon and Levi, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that circumcision would disable those men, and they even know when it would disable those men, because their father had bought adult servants before, because he was buying those servants even way back there with Laban. And under the Abrahamic covenant that Jacob was a part of, all Jacob's male servants purchased with money, they had to be circumcised. And so they've seen this effect on men their whole life. And they knew exactly when to attack. And they did attack, and they attacked those men of Shechem when they were at their very weakest. And even though Prince Shechem, he was wrong in what he did to Dinah, and no one could ever justify what Shechem did to Dinah, but even if Shechem was to be punished, and even if it was according to the Jewish law, which came later, that punishment would not have been death. According to the Jewish law that came about, Shechem would have been forced to marry the girl if he wanted to or not, and that was only if the father would permit it. And he would also be forced to pay a large sum of restitution, a payment to the father of the victim. But that punishment wouldn't have been death. But these sons of Jacob, they're very cruel and they're very violent. And they don't even just take out their vengeance on Prince Shechem. They murdered a whole city of innocent men, and they stole everything they had. They stole their herds, and they stole all their animals, and they enslaved all their women and their children. And they did all of this under the deception of peace. And this is way much worse than Shechem had ever done. They harmed many more innocent people. And this is what I see as one of the most tragic parts of this story, is that why Simeon and Levi were murdering all these men in Shechem, well, then they walk into Shechem's house. And we see that Dinah, that she was also living there, which means there wasn't an arrangement made and that Dinah was Shechem's wife. And we really never ever knew how Dinah felt about Prince Shechem. Maybe she loved him. And maybe she could understand their culture, and maybe she forgave them. Because you have to remember, the Bible does say that he was the most honorable man in that house. And it does say that he loved her and that he spoke kindly to her. So now she's being ripped out of her husband's arm, and he's being murdered by her brothers. And Jacob, he knew none of this was happening. Jacob is not a part of this plan at all. This act of deception and murder, Jacob is absolutely innocent. And we'll hear later that at Jacob's deathbed that he will curse Simeon and Levi. He'll curse their anger and he'll curse their cruelty. And he does not want his honor to be associated with them. And he's talking about this very event. And we can see even when Jacob does go to rebuke these sons for what they've done, because these people, they brought a death sentence upon their whole family. Because now Jacob, he's expecting a retaliation from all the other Canaanite tribes. Because these are really extended family to these Hivite people. They're all Canaanites. But Jacob here, he's a foreigner. He's not one of them. And Jacob, he's not a nation. He's small. He's just a man with a growing family, with a few kids and some servants. And in this type of patriarchal society, to carry out an act of war like this or an act of murder, it would have never been up to Simeon and Levi. It wasn't their choice in the matter. This would have been Jacob's choice. So they've overstepped their authority in their father's house. And these arrogant boys, which are really men, and they're violent men, they just look at their father and they don't even receive their father's rebuke. They wouldn't take their correction. All they did is just justify themselves. They justified all these murders. And it's all because one man mistreated their sister. And for that one act, that one man, they murdered and victimized a whole city. Way many more people than Shechem ever victimized in his whole lifetime. And they did it in a much more violent, harsher manner than the Prince Shechem ever did. But what you really have to see here is that God, that he never approved of this. And God never justifies any of these actions committed against these people. The Bible here is only reporting what happened. It never condones this, and it never justifies it. But also, the Bible, it never whitewashes all these crimes to make Jacob's family look better than they really are. And even though they are, and they are, the people of God, God always represents the shortcomings of his people honestly. We get to see these people with all their warts and with all their flaws. But the truth is that none of this ever had to happen. All of this happened because Jacob walked away from God. And he walked away from God's will for his life. And Jacob, he knew God's will because God told Jacob to return to Bethel. But Jacob, he thought he knew better than God because this land had such better pastures. Okay, so now we have Jacob here again, and he's afraid again, and he's scared. And he's scared like he was with Esau and like he was with Laban. And it's all because of his disobedience. And now he has his family, and they're all in ruins. One's a victim of rape, and now two of the others are now murderers. And the rest of the family, they're all having to run for their lives. And it's all because of Jacob's lack of godly leadership. and they're all living in chaos. And it's just like a Mexican soap opera. And I don't know if any of you know what this is like, but I do, because I walked away from God for a while. And it was a long time ago, and I knew him, and I knew Jesus. And when you walk away from God and from his will, you can find yourself so far away from him and so far away from that good life that he gave you. And you can find yourself where you never dreamed you could be. And you can get to the point where you don't even know how to come back to him. And the whole time that you're backsliding, because you really are saved and you really do know he's real. And when you know that, you can never get over that. And you end up mourning for him. And you mourn because you know what you left. And you know that he's good. And that the problem is with you and that it's not with him. And in my life, well, he brought me back from my backsliding in much the same way how he brought Jacob back. And it was through a series of pain. And by letting me know that I was not going to have any of his blessings my way. And when I did come to my end, and I was so sick of my cesspool life that I cried out to him and I confessed to him, I says, I don't know how to return to you anymore. And then he spoke to me. He spoke to my heart. And he told me to return to those simple things, the things that I used to do. He told me to pray, and he told me to read his Bible, and he told me to go to church. And I told him, but I don't even know where to go to church. And that same night, a small group of people, they ended up at my door, and they're knocking on my door, and they had a church right down the street. And so I went down the street and went to their service. And they told me they were just going through the neighborhood, inviting some people to come. But they never ever came before that night. And I've been at the house in a long time. And I've never ever known them to go out after that night. But that night I went with them. And that night my rebellion ended. And in this story, we see the same thing. God has a commitment to Jacob, and he doesn't leave him in the mess he made for himself. God intervenes into Jacob's life again, and he speaks to Jacob again. And you have to remember, God hasn't spoken to Jacob for at least 7 years while he's been in Shechem. But God loves him so much, he can't leave him the way he is. And so God says to him again, he says, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there. And God told him to make an altar there. But God's not just telling Jacob to return to a place called Bethel. What God is telling him, he's telling him to return to the relationship that he had with him. That was in Bethel. That's where they had fellowship. That's where God found Jacob. So God's will for Jacob, it hadn't changed in all these years. God was just waiting for Jacob to return to him. He was just waiting for Jacob to choose God again in obedience. And so now that Jacob's been called again, Jacob, he starts taking back the spiritual authority in his family. And he goes and he tells them, go clean yourselves up. Go purify yourselves. You all need to wash up. You need to change your clothes because you can't wear your blood-stained clothes from the murders you've committed and go up to God's house, go up to Bethel. And you can't bring your idols. You can't bring your little foreign gods with you. You can't bring those up to God's house either. And so he gathered up all their false gods. And those earrings that they were wearing, they weren't just regular earrings. Those earrings were tied to the pagan gods that they worshiped. And you kind of have to wonder, well, where did they get all these idols? Well, we know that Rachel, she stole some from her dad Laban. And you also see that Jacob was kind of letting everybody do their own thing. Even though he knew God, he didn't make everybody follow the God he knew. And so I imagine that those little gods and all those little earrings, well, where they got those is they got those off the dead bodies of the people as they were looting their houses and stealing their little gods. They were all stolen. So Jacob, he takes them all and he buries them around a terebinth tree in Shechem because that's where all those little gods belonged They belonged in pagan Shechem because there would be no place for them in Bethel where they were going, because now this is going to be a new life. It's going to be a new life of worship with the real God, and that's what we need to do. We need to bury our idols of our old life. We need to bury those in our past, because there's no room for those in our future with God. And you might say to me, well, hey, I don't serve idols. I don't serve little statues like they did. Well, they call them idols, but we often have the same practices in our lives. Because you might be serving money, well, they had a little idol for money. Or you might be serving pleasure, and they had a little idol for pleasure. Or you might be serving sex or drunkenness, or you might even be serving your own intellect, and they had little gods and little idols for all those things. So you could be serving all those things, but you just don't have the little figurines. So now if you're far from God, let me ask you, well, where's the last place God told you to go? And would it be possible that God would be telling you to go back there and to return to that place? That you need to return to your journey, to your Bethel, where you last had fellowship with him. And you might say to me, I don't know where God's telling me to go because I don't hear God. And if that's true, you need to ask yourself, do you really know God? Because God really does speak. And I'm not saying that he always speaks audibly, although he can speak audibly, but that's not the common way that he speaks to us. But he often speaks through the Word, through his Bible, and he speaks through his Holy Spirit to our spirit. And he can even speak into the circumstances of our life by giving us his peace or by taking his peace away from us. But if you've never heard him, you have a problem, because that means that you don't know him or you're not seeking him. And it might be that you don't believe him to be who he says he is. And Jesus says in Matthew 7:7, he says, ask and it will be given you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks, receive, and everyone who seeks, find, and to him who knocks, it will be opened. So if you seek Jesus, he will lead you and you will hear him, and then you'll start seeing him work in your life. So ask him to speak to you and see what happens. But I could still see somebody listening to this story of Jacob and thinking, well, so you're saying if I don't do what God told me to do, and if I leave what I think is his known will for my life, are you telling me that God is going to curse me with all these crazy, unbearable circumstances until I return to him? Well, that's not what I'm saying. God is not some kind of tyrant just waiting for someone to step out of line to punish him. But I would say this, outside of God's protection, by walking outside of his will, that is all this world has to offer you. It only can offer you chaos. Outside of God, outside of his love, outside of his protection, there's only pain in this world, suffering, disappointments, and tragedies. God, he doesn't have to create them to correct you. They are already there. That's all this world has to offer you without God.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,